I've been told I don't have a microphone, so I have to speak clearly and loudly, which is what I'm very good at, with an American Canadian accent, not with an English accent. Now, it is my great pleasure. I see we have a few more people, so we'll get the people join us. As I said, I have the great pleasure today to be able to introduce our next speaker and the person who's going to solve some of the problems dealing with climate change. As I said, I have the great pleasure of introducing Achim Steiner, who is presently the director of the Oxford Martin School, and in the past was with the United Nations Environmental Program and has a great extensive background in environmental law and policy, and now recently has been appointed to the United Nations Economic Program, which he will be moving to very shortly, I understand. Now, as I said, one of the things this morning we heard the last speaker gave a little bit of information about some of the very positive outlooks that Mr. Steiner has in looking at issues dealing with climate change. I went back to the program that was outlined in our handbook, and I said, okay, I'm not going to go to the positive, I'm going to go to let's get to work. And then we're going to give the platform to Mr. Steiner to speak. But my question is going to be, and he wrote this in the material that was in the handbook, what policies do we need to deal with climate change? And how can we get them enacted? So that's what he had written in the pamphlet that I read in the handbook. So I'm going to turn that question over to him to discuss and to work with this group in talking about what do we need to do to deal with climate change, and what can we do to enact the policies that are necessary to do that work. So if I can then...
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you. Well, Charlie, thank you very much for your kind words of introduction, and also, Charles, to you, I was just saying that this is the first time in my 33-year history of association with Oxford that I've actually been allowed to set foot in the Rhodes house. No, it's just one of those things, you know. I just returned to Oxford a year ago, and I was surprised at what a different experience Oxford is when you're not an undergraduate. I don't know if some of you, most of you are either, you know, postgraduates or have been here a while back. I've sort of had the pleasure of rediscovering Oxford, and clearly, you know, as an undergraduate, you must live a sort of mole's life with tunnel vision, because between the pub and your college and the lecture is a sort of, you know, magic triangle. And I now head the Oxford Martin School, which is, well, I would say one of the greatest additions to Oxford in its 700-800 year history, because what it has created is the ambition to draw on the brilliance of individuals working in their disciplines, but very often in academic research being forced to drill deep and narrowly, when the age in which we live requires us actually to connect all this specialized knowledge in order to find new solutions, in order to create connections where by discipline or by academic incentives, they're actually not being asked for. So Jim Martin, who donated this extraordinary gift to the university to set up the Oxford Martin School about 12 years ago, had at the back of his mind two things. One is we need to give people who have brilliant ideas and others are not ready to invest in the opportunity to do so, and premised on the fact that we will focus on problems of the 21st century that by definition require more than one discipline to be able to tackle them. So interdisciplinarity, not a new thing. In the Oxford Martin School, it is the DNA of what we look for. Secondly, that it must be solutions focused. Research for its own sake, fantastic. The knowledge frontier of humanity, absolutely. But there is also room for research that is laser sharply focused on trying to solve problems, because time is not on our side. And that was Jim Martin's credo, that, you know, the 21st century could be the greatest century in human history or its worst. And that brings me to, you know, the topic and the theme of today and tomorrow, which is climate change. Now, I will not present you any slides because I thought about it. I have hundreds. I just saw from the program also a couple of days ago that you would have had the basic overview of where we are in terms of climate science, climate responses. So my interaction with you this morning is very personal. I actually want to address you as people who live in a generation that will actually decide what will happen for the next few hundreds of years, and that as never before in human history, in a probably time frame of 10 to 50 years, literally decide what generations in future will have to deal with, who will not have the opportunity or the privilege to choose. That is actually the way we need to frame climate change. And to those of you who may, still sit here and say, well, I'm not sure if climate change is real, I'm not sure I believe climate science, don't look to me this morning. If the first two sessions have not yet persuaded you that we know enough to know that we need to act, then I don't think a quick 1 hour with me addressing you this morning would change that. But let me just say one thing. Anybody who today still says that climate change is something that I believe or do not believe in needs to rethink the language they're using. Climate change is not a matter of whether you believe in it or not. It is a scientific, empirically proven fact. So let's just for a moment accept that warming is happening, that our climate is changing, and we cannot deny the empirical evidence of that. Where science cannot answer everything is in two domains. One is, what will be the impacts on this extremely complex system called planet Earth? How will it manifest itself? Where will it impact what we have come to accept as a given, that rainfall is X in certain parts of the world, that tropical forests will thrive in the northern part of South America, and how our atmosphere will respond in terms of different chemicals being dumped into it. Because climate change is actually not very complicated. It makes the connection between things that we emit that get trapped in the atmosphere and that change the way that our atmosphere is then able to either let heat out or trap it. So this is not rocket science. So the science of what is happening on the planet right now is beyond a debate about whether you believe or do not believe in it. So what I would like to focus on this morning is really you and I, because what climate change is all about in my mind is what people who have the privilege and the opportunity to understand what is happening and how they respond to that. And as you saw also in the slides beforehand, I do belong to a group of people who are firmly convinced that human beings are not lemmings. We do not run into a wall deliberately. We do not jump off cliffs in the full knowledge that there is a cliff that if we jump off it, we will die, unless you want to commit suicide, and that is also part of human psychology. But collectively, it's just not a rational basis on which to look at how societies will decide to do things. So let me briefly take you through what, in the minds of many people, is often framed as the problem with climate change. And I would like, in our discussion with you, particularly to ask you to help me and help us understand, if we already know so much about what is happening, why is it so difficult to persuade, to convince, or to reassure people that we can actually do something about it? That's the real debate of the year 2017, not whether global warming is happening, whether it is an issue of the left or the right. This is the luxury of self-indulgence of those who have basically no sense of responsibility about what the consequences of their inaction is for future generations. Let me be as clear as that. So, I've dealt with the science, and if you still want to know more about the science, then by all means delve deeper, because what the science is telling us is we know enough to be very worried. We don't know exactly how some of these things are happening, and secondly, we certainly cannot predict with accuracy whether a 2-degree world will in fact trigger a 1.5, a 2 meter, or a 3 meter, or a 4 meter rise in sea levels. But just to make you a little bit more nervous, scientists have been extremely cautious. In fact, they've been bullied into being more conservative than they probably should have been. That is part of what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assured, that science was not about panicking society. It was about trying to say, this is what we know and this is what we don't know. In politics, the tendency is to err with, well, what we don't know, we should not act on, rather than actually saying, hell, if we don't know this, should we not be even more precautionary? So this is another way of looking at climate change. Where do you position yourself in your response strategy to something that essentially is defined by uncertainty and the need to manage risks? So just in the last couple of years, scientists, with the latest evidence that they're able to analyze in terms of the Arctic, the Antarctic, the glaciers of the world, have begun to revise their estimate about where sea level rise is likely to be at the end of this century by almost 100%. So you are here, you may comment on that, but we are talking now about a potential scenario of moving towards a 2-meter rise in sea levels as a possible scenario. So far, we were in the IPCC world, and I'm giving you very general caricature numbers now, hovering somewhere between 0.5 meter and 1 meter. So unless you shake your head, that's...
I think the IPC is a little low, and the 2 meters might be a little high, but it's possible.
Well, what I'm saying is the corrections are not downwards, they're upwards, which is really why, if you are, again, concerned about science, you'll never find a scientist who will say, I know for certain that this will happen, for many, many reasons that I just alluded to. But the scientific community collectively is revising most of its assessments of the significance of further warming upwards. So there is no reason to say, well, as we learn more about how this is unfolding, maybe it's not as serious as we thought. So let's put the science argument aside for a moment and ask ourselves, so what is the problem? Well, the next one is people say, we don't have the technology to deal with this issue. And it's not just about, renewable electricity generation or electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cells or battery storage. It's essentially about, how we run buildings. It's about people who say, well, maybe we should look at geoengineering solutions, carbon capture technologies. Can we somehow hoover up CO2 and store it in the ground again? And again, I would say to you, in human history, technology is largely a function of the need and the capacity combined with investment, research, and entrepreneurship. So for those of you who think that technology is the boundary that limits our capacity to respond to climate change, you are educated enough and wise enough to just take a look at the last 1,000 years and realize that technology rarely has been a limiting factor in human development. It is actually the means by which we are where we are today. Breakthrough after breakthrough after breakthrough. Whether it is the steam engine, whether it was the internet, the iPhones and apps that we use today, digital economies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, we haven't even begun to understand the capacity of human beings to unlock the ingenuity of technology to help us live with 10 billion people on this planet. So to those who say, technology is the reason why we're not moving forward, let me just say that is the feeblest excuse that I've come across. And just take something like renewable energy. In the last 20 years, we have moved from people saying, we don't have the technology. It's too expensive. You cannot run a national grid based on solar and wind and these things that come and go. At the end of the day, it's also too expensive. Well, the fact of the matter is that some of the successful economies in the world today have invested in the last 10 to 15 years heavily in renewable energy. So whether it is Germany, one of the most successful economies right now, its national electricity supply is now already surpassed, I think, 35% this year in terms of renewable electricity generation, largely wind and solar. Portugal is on average above 60%, Denmark above 40%, but also countries like Brazil, like China and India, not only the rich countries, because that was one of the arguments. Technology discriminates against the poor, especially when it comes to expensive renewable technology. China is today the largest investor in renewable energy. It is also the country that, because it used its domestic market to massively invest in the production of solar and wind technology that has enabled 1 billion citizens on the African continent to be able to buy into the renewable energy economy as a shortcut to access to electricity. Who would have thought that would happen? Because China's massive development of renewable production capacity in terms of manufacturing has brought the prices down so fast that even now, in 2016, the total investment volume in renewables was around $240 billion worldwide last year. The first headline figure that some newspapers use, it has dropped by 23% compared to the year before, when it was close to $300 billion. What they didn't write is that just in that 1 year, we have been able to produce 8% more new renewable energy infrastructure capacity with 23% less money than in the year before, because the price drop continues. Because there's one very simple economic principle why, in this day and age, anybody who tells you we are locked into a fossil fuel age and we can't afford to move into the renewables, let me put it this way. Economics is a very simple, and some would say simplistic, social science. But one thing that it is not wrong about is that if something is right, then sooner or later there will be very few people who can afford to buy it. If something is infinite, then it is basically a matter of finding the right business model to harness it. And the simple truth is, fossil fuels, the more we use them, the more expensive they will become over time. With renewable energy sources, they are limitless. The sun's not going to run out, the wind's not going to stop blowing. So the more we produce, the lower the cost is of actually using them. And that is precisely what has happened in 15 years. And so rapidly that we have had an energy revolution play out before our own eyes and have not realized it. Because last year, for the 4th year running, total investments in renewable energy, electricity generating infrastructure, i.e. new wind farms, solar farms, geothermal, biomass, exceeded the total investment in oil, gas, coal and nuclear facilities combined. 55% of total new electricity supplies last year built and invested in were renewable, excluding, let me emphasize, large hydro, which is, something that people still debate on which side it should stand. Electric vehicles, another example. I bought one when I moved into Oxford. It took a little bit of, persuasion that it's ripe enough to just say this is going to be my vehicle with which to get around. It's actually fascinating. It is no longer that expensive. Government subsidies help in the early phase. I have an electricity company that supplies me with electricity at my house, and therefore with the infrastructure around the motorway system in the UK gives me free recharges for the vehicle. I don't pay road tax. So the argument that I can't afford to buy an EV is out of the window. It's a bit of a pain that it only drives 150 kilometers or 100 miles before I have to recharge, but just wait 2 years and we will be at 300 to 400 miles and you won't even think about that anymore. So people who think that we are locked in to a transport sector that for the next 100 years can only succeed with diesel and petrol is completely misreading the situation. And again, you can trust me a little bit because I currently chair a council in Germany called the Agora Council on the Mobility Transition, which brings together various national ministries, the automotive industries such as BMW, the auto clubs of Germans who believe that driving a car is a fundamental human right. And I can tell you, we sit around the table in a closed door setting and we all basically see that by 2030 the combustion engine is essentially not going to be the platform on which transport will continue to be built. Does that mean it will happen without problems? No, and I'll come back to that in a moment, because in part these technology disruptions are difficult because they mean that some will be losers because they have invested in that. And we need to figure out how we focus on those who are threatened by these changes rather than view them simply as parties that are standing in the way. So for the broader economy also, the other argument, why can we not actually respond to climate change quicker? It always astonishes me. If you take the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, without fail, on average, companies that are greener and more sustainable are outperforming the mainstream of the FTSE and the DAX and the Dow Jones. If you look at countries who have invested heavily in environmental protection and renewable energy and higher standards, they're actually succeeding. China is only one example. Now you might say, yeah, but China is an environmental disaster. Well, precisely. That's why they're now spending hundreds of billions in trying to get out of that corner and are reinventing their 21st century economy under the principle of ecological civilization. I would urge you to remember this term. It is one that is coined in China, is now in its 5-year plan to describe the kind of vision that China is trying to pursue in moving out of an 20th century industrialization development mode into a 21st century mode of development. But even a country like Portugal, almost bankrupt 5-6 years ago, chose in the middle of its financial crisis to put a green economy package together as a stimulus to invest in renewables, in energy efficiency, in mobility, and has done really rather well. We can look to countries on the African continent. I lived in Kenya for 10 years. 8 years ago, Kenya adopted a green energy policy, deliberately saying, we want to see if we can exploit the massive reserves or resources in terms of geothermal power of the Rift Valley, wind power, solar power. Kenya is today a country that is doubling its electricity infrastructure, while at the same time succeeding in having an electricity grid system that is probably 80% renewable by now. Morocco, largest solar farm installations at the moment. Ethiopia, South Africa, Ghana. You could go across the continent. In Africa, where, remember, roughly 700 million people out of a 1 billion population on that continent do not have access to electricity today in the year 2017. So the fossil fuel century has not served them well, not even when they have oil in their own country. So renewables are actually a shortcut to creating access to energy for hundreds of millions of people, which is the fundamental need if you want to modernize your economy. Now, I'm only giving you a few examples. I'm not giving you the total pros and cons, but I just want to give you a few nuggets to demonstrate to you how distorted the discourse sometimes is when it comes to people arguing about climate change. And, you know, science aside, we haven't got the technology. It's not doable, economically not viable. Rich countries can afford to do it. Poor countries can't. No, it's a matter of deciding that this is a priority, that the risks of not doing something are so high that we should invest in it, and then you are able to move. And perhaps the weakest, and in some ways, nevertheless, most important argument is one about equity. Now, in the short term, people argue that, you know, greener technologies, greener economies are too expensive. Poor people can't afford the price for renewable energy. They can't afford to buy an electric vehicle. And therefore, doing these things discriminates against the poor. On a global level, it was the argument that the South, first of all, shouldn't be making up for the emissions of the North of the last 150 years. I think that argument, you know, is less and less of a blockage, even though its validity is certainly one that I would still say is not without cause and reason. But in fact, with the examples I just gave you, in many developing countries, the transition towards a greener and more sustainable economy that helps us to bring down carbon emissions is increasingly viewed as an opportunity. But equity is extremely important, and as I said to you at the beginning of my presentation, it is also an intergenerational issue. And this is why we live in such a different moment of time. I cannot think of a parallel where in a window of 30 to 50 years, a group of people in the history of humanity could decide what happens on this globe for the next 500 years. And therefore, when we think about equity, first of all, it is a public policy challenge. We have to make sure that the poor don't end up paying more than the rich for bringing our economies, our infrastructure into a low carbon age. We also have to make sure that those who don't have the means to invest in these transitions, for example, to get investment capital on a scale to allow these things to happen, are left out. That's why international cooperation, development, finance are so critical to allow the global community to move together. So all this to say, if you accept for a moment, and I don't want you to simply say, well, okay, that sounds all persuasive, but just hypothetically speaking, if you accept for a moment that the science is not really the contest anymore, that technology is not an argument against making these transitions, that our economies actually can succeed and thrive if you were to move to a low-carbon economy, and that the equity consideration is both manageable through public policy and actually almost a responsibility to bring into the discussion, what is it that is stopping us from moving ahead faster? And who actually now has the responsibility to lead? We have a Paris Agreement, remember, 2 years ago, a unique moment in human history, the first time that virtually all nations on Earth agreed on a common strategy to address a planetary threat. The only other precedent was the Montreal Protocol, which dealt with the hole in the ozone layer, which has been, the most successful environmental treaty ever, and has actually succeeded in bringing the world to a point where it can now actually monitor that the ozone hole is closing and that we are repairing our atmospheric ozone layers. So, very briefly, this was also a session about public policy. Now, in public policy, we always say it's the government. But I want to point for a moment to the first word, public. That is you, me, us together with the rest of this room together with the rest of Oxford, the rest of Oxford, the rest of the UK, the rest of the UK with the rest of the European Union until it leaves the European Union, but put that aside. And so goes the logic until you're talking about 7 billion people doing things differently together. Public policy is not something that, as citizens, I think we can simply delegate to government. And that's why I wanted to, take advantage of the invitation to join you here this morning, because public policy depends on each one of us. And for those of us privileged enough to have had an education, the self-confidence, the opportunity to stand in a public arena or work in a company or have a public office, to actually speak to the important issues of our time, that's where leadership responsibility actually is. The collective response to leadership by individuals. And there is an amazing individual amongst us here, Bill McKibben. And you will, hear from him presumably tomorrow or later today. That is an example of a person who, was neither famous nor rich nor had a whole corporation and has become a backbone of a global movement. Another wonderful example is a woman called Wangari Maathai. I don't know if you may recall, she was the first Nobel Prize winner, woman from Africa, but also was given the Nobel Prize because of how she brought responsible stewardship for the environment with peace together. And she began literally planting trees with illiterate women in a remote part of Kenya. That was her way of beginning to exercise leadership and rose to become, an icon in terms of civil society leadership. And planting trees was a brilliant idea because everybody can plant a tree. That's another thing. Don't always start with the most complex problem that makes everybody feel inadequate and disempowered. Start with actually doing something where everybody feels they can make a difference. But at the end of the day, we do need public policy also in the sense of governments. And why do we have governments? Because they, hopefully, in an elected and democratic context, represent interests in our society. They mediate, they facilitate, they accelerate transitions. They also correct market failures. And they also protect us from, let's say, decisions that may be taken because of excessive influence by a few that are not in the interests of the many. So in trying to deal with climate change, we do need public policy more than ever before, because of this extraordinary narrow window of time that we have. We have to reinvent our economies in the next 40 years. We are trying to decarbonize our economies by around 2050 to a level of about 80% less carbon emissions. You heard about the carbon budget earlier on. This is nothing short of literally reinventing the way we fuel our economy, in transport, in buildings, in aviation, in food production, in energy generation, and therefore to simply allow the market to do that would first of all not recognize that there are many market failures built into our current economies already. In the United States, people pay more in tax rebates to the oil companies than they actually pay in taxes in the exploration segment of the oil and gas sector. I'm not sure if this is still true in 2016, 2015, but it was in 2014. We subsidize fossil fuel use across the world with $600 to $800 billion a year. And the IMF says that if you add all of that up, it actually amounts to $3 trillion of subsidies every year. So these distortions are there, and governments and public policy must be held accountable to, first of all, correct these distortions, and secondly, help society to make these transitions. Simple example. Automotive industry in Germany says, well, we can't be held responsible for putting up charging stations all over Germany. We produce cars. German government says, yeah, but why should the taxpayer invest in putting these things up? So they spent 10 years debating that. Instead, they could have gotten together and said, okay, this is a 50-50 deal. We pre-finance, you repay us as the revenue model begins to succeed, and we will have a recharging infrastructure, which is one of the greatest constraints for getting electric mobility into a mass market going. This is basically where feed-in tariffs that allowed renewable energy investors to be attracted to invest in this because they had a guaranteed return, fiscal policies, subsidies, or simply saying to people, those of you who take public transport will be better off at the end of the month because you're causing society less long-term costs in terms of health, infrastructure, and so on. Let me end by saying that that kind of public policy tool set is phenomenal. And we just need to begin to understand how to use it in a smart way so that we're helping to not replace markets and private sector entrepreneurship by governments, but that we are using public policy to enable new markets, new technologies, and above all, a far greater response in terms of time and scaling up to happen. And that same logic extends to the international level, because climate change, in many respects, is the most weird and unprecedented phenomenon. It doesn't actually matter to the future of humankind whether America were to stop emissions tomorrow if the rest of the world wasn't doing the same. It is an unprecedented phenomenon that emissions are atmospheric in terms of their consequences or in terms of the impact they cause, and therefore only in the collective capacity to reduce emissions do we create the conditions to actually manage a world that will hopefully stay below 1.5 degrees of global warming. And that is why the United Nations, multilateralism, the ability to, over very different histories, responsibilities, and capacities to act, we create the conditions to allow 7 billion people to actually do things together. And that is why the Paris Agreement is such an extraordinary milestone. We, I think, should recognize that if the United Nations and the world of science had not created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and protected the science from politics and national interest over 25 years, we would not have had the world know what was going on in, let's say, as clear a way as the IPCC enabled us to do. And if we did not then have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that every year, and I use the word carefully but deliberately, forced leaders of all nations to step into the limelight, sit around the table and be watched by the world's peoples in terms of whether they were actually responding and how they were responding to this. If that had not happened, we would not have a global climate response that came out of Paris in 2015. Is it sufficient? No. Is it guaranteed that it will work? No. Can it be destabilized by particular nations taking a decision to ignore it or not fulfill their pledges? Absolutely. Will humanity tolerate it? Absolutely not. I think, in the larger scheme of things, there will always be setbacks. But if you look at the future of climate change in defining our lives and that of future generations, there is no doubt that inaction is ultimately criminal. And I, again, use that term deliberate. In future courts, those who, and it is not an issue of denial and so on, this is debate. It is the issue of the responsibility to act to protect people and the rights of future generations that are not acted upon when knowledge was there, the means to act were also there, and the opportunity was not seized. And I want to end by just giving you a couple of analogies, because climate science is largely inaccessible to 99% of humanity. All of you, presumably, or most of you, have a smartphone. Also, presumably, most of you haven't got a clue how your smartphone works. But you can use it. You use it every day, and brilliant people have given us the apps to make use of a technology we have no clue how it works, but that opens up a universe of possibilities for us. Look at climate science the same way. You don't need to be an atmospheric scientist and understand the work of Bill. What you and I and everyone need to accept is that we have a responsibility to act on what Bill and the world community of scientists is telling us. And secondly, to yes, challenge the political discourse that is led by those who say it doesn't matter, because it really does matter. Last example is we need to change also the language and make people realize more how dramatic this phenomenon is in terms of what is likely to play out. So when climate scientists tell us there is a 5% probability that we may actually end up having a 4 to 5 or 6 degree warming reality in future. To most of us, 5% sounds like, very remote a possibility. If I were to tell you, I'm going to take you to London Heathrow in an hour's time, and I'm going to put you on a plane that has a 1 in 20 chance of crashing, that's 5%, right? 1 in 20 chance of crashing. Is there anyone in this room who would step on that plane? No, there wouldn't be. That's how serious, how dramatic, but also how sometimes divorced that realm and frontier of scientific understanding is from where people actually feel empowered to act. So my question to you, and hopefully for the discussion now, is what are we going to do about this? I mean, who is responsible to lead in this moment of transition, of knowing enough, not knowing everything, but having to act? And my point to you is, don't look to the abstract political leadership or the corporate world. What is it that individuals can do, and from there build the kind of systemic changes that we're looking for? Thank you very much, and let's see where we go with the discussion. And I mean, if you feel put unduly under pressure, then don't take it personal and talk about your neighbor and what they could do. But I would love to hear a little bit, what do you think happens next in this scenario?
Start with a quick question. I wanted to sort of push you on, you said policies, like what specific policies would you suggest are effective to support and the ones that are ineffective? Like I think there's stuff floating on cap and trade, carbon tax, like what have you seen? Yeah, what is effective on that if you just start that?
Well, the most effective examples are rooted in two principal logics of public policy. One, Lord Nicholas Stern is a person and a name who has often been associated with putting that in the context of climate change, which is correct for the distortions in our economy. Because it's not just the subsidies, for example, the fossil fuels. If you take the full costs into account that emissions cause, then the economics of using oil or coal versus solar or wind changes very rapidly. It's the full costing of a technology choice. So I think one of the things that we need to get much better at, because it is a foundation for having a rational choice, is to say it is not just the cost of digging something up and turning it into a fuel and then using it to create a kilowatt hour of transport or a mile equivalent of distance traveled. It is the full cost, the true cost of using different resources. And that's where our economies of the 21st century can't live anymore in this, let's say 18th, 19th, 20th century view that, well, if you use something up here, we'll go and find something else. The brutal truth is, every year in London, over 9,000 people, in terms of live equivalent lost, die because of air quality, right? In London, this is the 21st century. Worldwide, indoor and outdoor pollution kill 7 million people every year prematurely. That's an extraordinary toll. I mean, this is in the name of development, of the luxury of being able to drive my car down the road. It's a license to kill, and we accept it. So my point is economics and public policy, first of all, have to create the conditions under which we can make more rational choices. Secondly, I think we do, and we have done so in the past and have proven it, whether it is the United States in the 19th, 20th century in particular, Korea and Taiwan, in the latter part of the 20th century, Europe post-war with the Marshall Plan. There are moments in history where societies invest in an accelerated and deliberate effort to move from one platform to the next, from one level to the next. And I think this is where, if you take the climate-specific challenge, we have to decarbonize our economies. What are the three major sectors? They are energy, transport, agriculture. Then you start getting, cross-cutting platforms. It's buildings. I don't know how many of you know, but in the next 50 to 100 years, I think, yes, in the next 50 to 80 years, we will build the equivalent of the entire urban stock of buildings again on this planet, right? And in just 80 years, we will double urban infrastructure again. We are building cities now in extraordinarily unreformed ways, right? I remember being in Dubai a few years ago, which is a city that didn't exist in its, it existed, but not in its extraordinary vertical manifestation and horizontal spread 30 years ago. I was sitting in traffic jams and I was thinking, with all the brilliance of urban planners and the resources available, how could that happen that we build a city in the 21st century ending up again with people not being able to move but being stuck in traffic jams? Now, United Arab Emirates quickly rethought, put public transport in, built bigger roads, but mobility. 97% of the time a car in Europe is actually parked, right? So we spend salary or half a year's salary, depending on how well off you are, on buying this thing that is parked, is stationary 97% of the time. Is this the most intelligent form to ensure mobility? And then we argue, well, people have a right to buy a car. Well, I recently learned in London that 40% of London households actually don't own a car. So those people who argue, well, the poorer people can't afford electric vehicles and taxis and so on, well, the poorer people in London, quite frankly, haven't got a car now and won't have one in the near future. So don't use the poor people to argue why a big BMW diesel car should have access to central London without paying, a congestion charge and, quite frankly, a pollution charge. And that's where we get into the terrain then of how do you find smart public policy and regulation that does not narrow the scope for entrepreneurial creativity, ingenuity, new business models, because there's often the argument, why is a civil servant better at choosing solar versus wind versus coal than the entrepreneur? I think there is a good point here. We should have smart regulation that says, look, our objective is low carbon. How exactly we can do that is where we need the creativity of research, of investors, of entrepreneurs, create the markets into which people can come with solutions. And that's what we have seen, happen time and again. So I think, I could give you a whole litany of, examples now, but just if you are interested in it, you can study the evolution of how photovoltaic and wind energy have become such a dramatic growth sector. Initially, it was a feed-in tariff. It simply said, okay, we need this stuff. We're going to guarantee you a price for the next 20 years if you're willing to put panels on the roof or put $1 million in an investment to get these things going. That's Germany's model, Denmark's model. Very successful. In fact, it was so successful that they realized that they had locked themselves into a price that they could have halved already within 5 years. And that's where some of the costly debates in Germany arose, that by locking in 20 years, which they thought they needed to do at point X about 10 years ago, they underestimated how quickly the market would actually become familiar with this and would do it for half the price. And because it was now so profitable, there was an explosion in people wanting to put solar panels up and wind turbines, and Germany basically couldn't afford to keep up with the interest in investing in this. So one model. South Africa, Brazil have used another model. They've said, okay, we'll use auctions. So we'll put a tender out and say we want so many megawatts of electricity produced by solar, and you can bid to get this contract. And this has been probably one of the most extraordinary things, because there are now prices per kilowatt hour being offered by investors to build this infrastructure that people thought there was a zero in the wrong part behind the comma. Massive drop. I mean, the cost per kilowatt hour of producing, for instance, solar energy in high solar areas of the world is probably dropped by 85% in the last 15 years. 85%. And therefore, here is another example of a regulatory step or a policy that was put in place. You can also use laws. I mean, we've banned asbestos. So should we ban diesel? And if diesel and PM2.5, the particle matter, that basically enters into your lungs and then causes respiratory diseases, cancer, and so on, if that literally is such a problem and diesel cannot be cleaned up, should we then consider maybe banning diesel? Will a ban of combustion engines one day be the next step? And this is where, in my work with many private sector leaders, I don't find it difficult to arrive at a similar view of the future. Most of them today recognize that the low carbon economy is a given. The question is, how quickly is the transition? And here comes the third aspect of public policy. How can we help those who may have been encouraged to invest in coal-fired power stations or, gas-guzzling vehicles, because that was the market, that was the vision of mobility. I mean, imagine America. I mean, the bigger your car was, the bigger the engine, the more came out the back in 1950, the cooler life was, right? That was the paradigm. 40 years later, we point our fingers at them and say, what are you building? You're causing harm and you have the wrong products. It's easier for the car industry. I think they have been too slow in reacting. It's much more difficult for people who build something and need 30 years to recover their investment. So now the question is, how do we work with those who may be losers in this accelerated transition? And can we make that easier? Because otherwise you do get the lobbyists who will put so much money into stopping things from happening and moving simply because they are so afraid of what they will lose. Some legitimate, some simply greedy. And let's be honest, that's the spectrum of self-interest. But I think the environmental movement, climate change policy, governments, the private sector, and investors particularly, do need to look carefully at how you create fair conditions for these very disruptive moments and moments of transition. And I hope that sort of gives you a sense of the menu. And I mean, I've spent the last 2 years working a lot on financial markets, the role of central banks and financial regulatory authorities to look at how could we actually ensure that those who want to move into a cleaner economy have access to finance, because our financial sector, which controls 80% in most, let's say, OECD countries of money that circulates in our economy, it's not public budget, it's not the government budget, it's actually private money. If that money is not willing to invest in this, and it often is not ready, what are the incentives we can create? Because without access to capital and finance, the best entrepreneurial idea, the most visionary car builder or energy developer has no chance. And not everybody is Elon Musk, who is willing to bet everything, risk everything, and almost lose everything 3 times over before having a breakthrough. And that's why we also need to think of our financial system. It's not just because of the financial crisis. One of the things that I believe we need to spend a lot of time on in the coming years is to ask ourselves, whose money is this in the first place? And why should this money be completely divorced from overarching objectives that our societies believe are important? Our financial system is not just a playground for speculators. This is our pension money, these are our savings, this is the money that we have accumulated collectively as a society. Yes, by all means parceled up into private ownership. But actually we are all owners of this financial system. And there is, I think, an interesting moment of debate right now. Is there a different set of incentives that a financial market can be given in terms of investing in things that are beneficiary to the investor but also to society, as opposed to the opposite? So finance, technology, fiscal policy, research policy, smart regulation and market platforms on which these things can roll out. Yes, please.
So you mentioned energy auctions in South Africa as a very successful model, but with the current difficulties, I think the program has stalled because the utility has refused to take on projects to sign more of the power purchase agreements. I was just wondering, do you think it's replicable across Africa still, or might feed-in tariffs be the more, prudent way to go forward?
I'm not up to date enough in terms of why it is stalling right now, but I think what we have seen happening in all of these pioneer frontier markets is that the calibration of instruments is something that is highly dynamic. It is even context specific. So maybe in South Africa it may have more to do with the volatile exchange rate that makes investors suddenly put a different premium on lending money onto the African continent. I mean, most people don't realize that Africa, because of its perceived and real uncertainty and risk factors, usually has to pay an extraordinary premium to borrow money on the international financial markets. So, already the cost of investing is higher. But, as in South Africa it may be stalling, you can go to the United Arab Emirates and see how it is taking off. Saudi Arabia will in the coming years become one of the largest investors in renewable energy infrastructure. So things are moving, I think, both in terms of geographical concentration and also in terms of national fine-tuning. I gave you the example of Germany in trying to figure out how can they get off that immense cost curve that they had promised at the time, and so I had to rethink the feed-in tariff structure, but also putting some ceilings in for the moment, and secondly, figuring out a better way to do it. I don't think there's a singular way of doing it. I mean, that's the beauty of markets. Different instruments, different possibilities. What it needs is, I think, government and investors and society, in a larger sense of the public good, designing and co-designing these systems, because that's when usually they work best. People often are surprised, why are Germans or Danes willing to pay more for a kilowatt hour of electricity so that it is green? Because they believe in it. There is a consensus in Germany that even if people are sometimes frustrated about the electricity bill, 70% support the green energy policy in Germany across all party lines and population groups. So building that consensus and making sure that these transitions are perceived to be not just for the few, but are actually provable in the sense that they're for the benefit of the many, I think is a critical part. How one then deals with these individual instruments, I think, is also a matter of chronology. I mean, where you start maybe with a crude auction system initially, you may have particular technology domains subsequently. But in South Africa for a long time, the problem was that Eskom, the South African utility, government-owned public utility, was so singularly wedded to coal, because South Africa was sitting on massive coal supplies. Eskom had invested a lot of money in research about how to use coal really into the 22nd century for South Africa. And then suddenly along comes climate change and people are told, sorry, your coal is actually not something you should be using. So in South Africa there was a big battle between the energy gurus, who were entirely brought up, trained, lived in a coal economy, and were suddenly being told, can you please move aside, it's solar and wind that are coming. So South Africa lost quite some time there, and I think this is a story that has replicated itself in many countries. Those who run a status quo, the contemporary system, are not always the best ones to actually invent the next generation system. And that is a difficult part of this, dealing with those who have something to lose, whether perceived or otherwise. And I can speak firsthand, because I spent quite a lot of time with Eskom managers and engineers, debating this, and the injustice that the world had created climate change. South Africa has all this coal, and now you're telling us we can't use this stuff, right? And what an injustice. From that end to right through to, you'll never be able to compete with coal and forget about it. Sorry, there were two hands here. Do you want to say? Yeah.
I was just thinking of your question on public policy and just going back to the public. I was wondering how smart policy and entrepreneurial policy interacts with publics and counter-publics who exist outside Western development narratives, or people whose ideas of conservation life exist outside. And I was wondering how, whether there are productive frictions between, say, policy produced at an abstract level and interacting with people who are most affected and most vulnerable to climate change. And I was wondering how you address that.
Well, you're pointing to something that I think is, if we had another day, the other part of this whole climate change story, that it plays out so differently in different places with different groups of people around the world. If you are a Pacific Islander, you may be poor, but you're also threatened essentially with having your nation state exist in the future. A 1 meter sea level rise means that for quite a number of Pacific Island nations, the only option that's left is to move. So you become essentially a refugee. And I happen to, at the moment, also work as the envoy for the Platform for Disaster Displacement in Geneva, which is trying to tackle this issue of, in international law, there is no status for people who have to leave their place because they're drowning. We have an international law regime for people who have to flee conflict. And even though it is being undermined at the moment by many, there is a principle of protection that we offer. There is nothing that will protect maybe 10 million people in Bangladesh who may have to move, or 20 million, and we can all speculate about the numbers. It is a simple fact of life that if sea levels rise by a meter or up to 2 meters, whether in 50 or 100 or 150 years, there will be hundreds of millions of people worldwide who will simply not be able to continue in the same mode in the same place. Let me put it in those generic terms. And that's my departure point. So I would say the debate about electric vehicles in the UK is different to the discussion about sea level rise or rainfall patterns in the Sahel. And the responses will be different. But two things, I think, point to why we need to work together on this. One is what happens in Europe will affect what happens in Africa. So that basic logic in terms of climate change just binds us together whether we like it or not. And we have to think collectively about addressing this. But secondly, we also have to learn to get out of this node of having singular solutions. For instance, in Africa today, I already alluded to it, the African Union, the member states of the African Union went to Paris and negotiated with the international community an Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, where they said, look, we're willing to accelerate our actions if you are willing to also invest in us being able to move faster into renewables. Because for us, it makes sense to go renewable. But we don't have access to the capital, we don't have the policies in place, so we need support if you want us to do this in a short period. So what is, in a sense, two very different interests. Europe, to take two regions for a moment, looks at the African continent and says, damn, only 300 million people have access to electricity today, so another 700 million people will come to the grid. There will be another billion people living in Africa by 2050. That means 2 billion. That means 1.7 billion people will come onto the grid in the next 40 years in Africa. Forget about China in the last 30 years, right? And what happens in Africa in the next 35 years in the energy and electricity sector is far greater in terms of consequence for the world than what happened in China in the last 30 years. So Europe needs to frame its view of this as we have a vested interest in making sure that Africa chooses a low carbon energy infrastructure development path. In Africa, the first priority is if you don't have electricity, who cares about carbon emissions right now, right? We need to get electricity to people. But why not go for renewable energy if we can, figure out a way in which to leverage capital and technology to get this thing on the ground in our villages without maybe having to rely on building a national grid first in order to connect, the last 20% of our population who live in remote areas. And that's why I often say to people, you could even forget about the whole science of climate change. So many of the actions that we associate with moving towards a low carbon economy are win-win outcomes in the medium to long term, that our major challenge is to figure out how can we organize the transition in economic, technology transition and equity terms. Because if Africa is able to say, look, with a little bit of additional investment, we create essentially an indigenous energy supply. We will be independent of the world's energy markets, because right now, particularly vulnerable nations, small economies across a continent like Africa, are really screwed every time the oil price decides to jump from 20 to 100 down to 70 again, then it's 40 and then it's 50 again. This is immensely expensive for a country that has to use its farmers to generate the foreign exchange to buy petrol on a capriotic world market for fossil fuels. So in Kenya right now, you have the largest wind farm in Africa being built, 350 megawatts in the Turkana region. They have better wind conditions than North Sea offshore wind. The challenge was to build a road to be able to get the turbines from the port in Mombasa to this remote region, and secondly, to get somebody to help them to build the, I think, 200-kilometer power line to connect that remote region to the national grid. Once that was done, they can build another 350 or another 1,000 megawatts up there. And that's why I think the argument that these choices are fundamentally different for small, large, rich and poor countries hold up to a point, because the conditions are different. But I think more often than not, it is because of the need to work together and because we depend on one another's ability to act, that we also create opportunities for things to happen that may not have looked connected, but now suddenly create a co-benefit. And I think that in part speaks to small-scale farmers, people who have not had access to electricity to this day, people who will have to cope with the risks from far more frequent droughts and extreme weather events, people who are on the front line, if you want, of climate change also. I don't know if we got a little bit more time, because there are a couple more questions.
We have time. We have 10 more
Yeah.
minutes.
Okay, there's two questions, and this lady's been waiting quite a long time. And now, Tim.
Thank you very much for that. One reason I find this particular policy challenge particularly interesting is the ideas of scale in policy when it comes to climate change. And I think particularly the disjoints in scale. So the particular example I have in mind is between city and international. So I work a fair amount with infrastructure policy, for example, in energy and transport. Some of the major leaps have been particularly at a city level, where you see the likes of C40 and mayors and things taking particular action to design very effective policy at a city scale to institute changes around planning. But you've also necessarily got the involvement of institutions with the likes of Paris, which generate the kind of global vision which incorporates ideas of climate justice very effectively, but arguably don't actually have a real principle of translating into policy. And it seems like, to me, you're welcome to disagree or add more nuance to it, but it seems like there's a fair amount of disjoint between the international and the city when it comes to conversations about how you go about diffusing policy. And I'm just interested to know from your perspective, and then particularly from UNEP's perspective as well, what the relationship is there between the global and the city level policy challenge.
Well, first of all, the closer you are to where people have the right to decide something, the more, forward-looking, progressive thinking, whatever you want to call it, becomes possible. So, a Mayor Bloomberg maybe in New York City, or, a mayor in Paris, or in Bogota, or wherever you want to go. I mean, there are, elected mayors who are leaders and who take advantage of the fact that they have, let's say, the mandate and the means by which to do innovative things. And I think those are the laboratories, if you want, of our global innovation lab, if you want. I think the point about the disconnect or the disjoint, I would not describe it as that. I think in part, the ability for international action to evolve builds on the innovation and the proof in principle or proof of concept that happens in smaller units, whether it's a city or whether it's a corporation or a community. So that population of validation experiments, examples, has grown enormously. And I think it is not at all to be viewed as peripheral or because it is small in size, not central to this overall direction. But at the same time, it is because of the global process, first of all, that allowed the science of climate change to become the canvas against which we now have to draw an image of development in the future. Then I think a lot of mayors in the first place began to think, hell, we actually have to think about decarbonization of our cities. It's because of that whole international networking and platforms among scientists, but also the private sector, communities, NGOs, that people start exchanging ideas. So there is a whole economy of creativity that depends on people being able to get together. And I think the global climate process, whether it is at the actual UN hosted events or the many other workshops and platforms that are then created, is critical. But most importantly, is that something like the Paris Agreement is a way in which everybody who looks at what's likely to happen in the next 15 to 20 years got a certified statement that the future is going to be low carbon. We may struggle, we may debate, is it quicker, is it slower? But what Paris clearly said is to citizens, but also to investors, to those people who have to make technology choices, to the people who are now designing the next 10 million person city in the world, that factoring in low carbon is not only a desirable thing, it's actually, it would be stupid not to do it. And an interesting litmus test will be how will investors react to the new US administration's interest in reviving coal. It's not unique to the United States, but it's particularly pronounced there at the moment. I think most people already, even in the financial sector, are saying, if you change the politics around coal, you are unlikely to change the economics around coal. And therefore, the long-term future is not in coal. If you have $1 billion you can invest in a power station or infrastructure right now, why would you invest it in a coal-fired power station that most likely will be in more trouble over the next 10 to 15 years, whether through a new government or because the world really will start panicking about climate change, and investing in something that is already low carbon or maybe even renewable, and that you have seen now in hundreds of billions of dollar examples around the world happening. So the climate process of the UN is both tackling the argument that for so long, particularly in the United States, was used, well, if China and India are not part of this, then why should we bother? Well, problem solved. Second argument is, if you are an economy, can you really risk investing? And it is a very big risk to invest in a low carbon infrastructure future when you are just at the beginning of these big shifts. Where do we get the assurance that governments really are serious about this? Well, you can't get a more clear assurance than a conference of the parties such as Paris issuing such an agreement. And in that sense, I think what is happening at the local level has both enabled things to happen globally, but ultimately to go to scale requires the global framework in order for people to have the confidence to take pilot projects or initiatives that are very much built around a city or a business system-wide. That's how I think change happens.
I'm bothered by the internal contradictions of what you're saying, in the sense, not you personally, but I mean the whole realm of logic you're exploring. And I wonder if we could pursue them here or maybe later today. And it has to do with the difference between what the promise of new energy technologies provide and thinking about the implications if they're actually real. Because you actually get more energy in rural Africa or anywhere else. Energy is used to process materials. And we've got the thing around 180 degrees in the wrong direction. We think, especially in America, that we live in a world with infinite material wealth and finite energy. And we're spending billions of dollars a day trying to assure everyone that it's just a geologic mistake that energy is in the Middle East, and that's really our energy over there, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in fact, we live in a world with finite resources and infinite energy. 180 degrees around. The question I put to you here is simply this: what if we do get that energy? Are we going to restrain ourselves from processing materials, which are the finite things? If not, you see, if there isn't a complete reverse of the logic of the coupling of energy and materials processing, we're just going to accelerate our own collapse. Second problem has to do with, again, an internal contradiction between international solutions to global problems. You've been using the two terms more or less interchangeably, as if the UN were some sort of global means of addressing climate change. It's not. It's an international one, wherein the principle of the nation state is reinforced, not dissolved or transcended. And we have nation states that are irrevocably committed to growth economics, not steady state economics, not bad year economics, not sort of wind down the growth metaphor. They're all competing with one another to grow. Oh, mine went faster than yours. And we have an international monetary system. You know, look, just yesterday, IMF was saying, well, we can grow more. You know, growth is still the perpetual metaphor for something that can't happen and won't happen on a finite planet. So how do you hold out hope for addressing these issues only through international fora, which reinforce the nation-state structure, which is precisely what has to be transcended?
Right. Can you invite me back next year and No, maybe very briefly. Let me start off maybe with the latter. There is principle and there is pragmatism, and I was once given an award for principled pragmatism. Now, I don't know if that's a contradiction in terms, but that is my departure point. So if I look to the world today and I need to figure out where do I have the most legitimate platform for convening the global citizenry, then it is only the United Nations. There is no other forum in which every nation state has a seat and a vote and a right to be heard. I think we often forget that. You know, this is a very imperfect world and people dismiss a lot of things. Show me one other place where even Vanuatu has the right to be heard next to the United States and Russia and China. There is none. And I deeply believe in protecting that right to be heard. It is an imperfect world. It is, you know, hegemonial in some parts. It is economically self-interested, and we have lived through an age that not only, you know, argues for growth, it also says that national success is premised on somehow outdoing all the others. So there are many things that are wrong with our economic paradigm. And therefore, I just want to signal to you, and those of you who are interested, I have spent the last 10 years in particular trying to bring this, you know, discourse between environment, sustainability, and economics and the model of development into something that is, let's say, more connected. And I deliberately align myself with the term transition towards a green economy rather than green growth, because I think greening growth is, you know, it's not a destination, it's just a step. And, you know, there are some things in greening growth that are perfectly aligned with a, you know, greener economy or even a sufficiency economy in the sense of moving towards it. What you're pointing to is, you know, the economic fundamental assumptions that have allowed us to, you know, believe that we are at the pinnacle of human civilization, and we certainly are in terms of being the wealthiest in generic terms, when we count our financial capital only. So it all goes to, is growth actually the foundation for, you know, success and wealth? Secondly, how do we compare the, you know, financial wealth that we measure through GDP, which everybody agrees nowadays is a, you know, such a crude concept that it should have gone out of the window 50 years ago, with, for example, the ecological infrastructure or the natural wealth or the natural capital, functional ecosystems. And, you know, there is a lot of work happening on that. But you point to an even more challenging thing. So the more electricity we have, the more rapacious we could become. Now, here I simply would posit the challenge back to you. That's also a presumption, because we can make choices. And we can use more access to energy to have a more circular economy, invest in more recycling, because the energy we needed and that was too expensive in the past to recycle all the precious metals from phones and microwaves and so on now becomes affordable. And just to take one very simple example. But you're absolutely right. We should not assume just because we have cleaner energy that we don't solve other issues. Now, today's topic was climate change. I mean, I would urge you, if you're interested, on the UNEP website, there's a lot of interesting stuff on the green economy. Part of why I have very much focused on that framing is that, if you do something for climate change, you can actually also benefit biodiversity. You can protect ecosystems. So when people talk today about carbon capture technology that hasn't been invented yet in a sufficiently robust way, that is so expensive that it's difficult to conceive of it as a short-term solution, I say to them, so why are you always only talking about technology when in fact we know that you can plant trees, restore ecosystems, and actually store and capture carbon? So you would not only create incentives for landowners to keep forests, restore ecosystems, have a greater resilient ecological infrastructure around the world, you would have protection of biodiversity, and all of that financed through, let's say, the decarbonization imperative of the 21st century. So it's our economy as a whole that I think has to be the framework in which we move, and therefore natural resources, whether in the sense of exploiting through digging, through growing, through cutting, the way we feed ourselves, the whole agricultural sector has to be part of this. That's why I say we are, in a sense, at the point of transitioning towards a green economy that I think is foundational for being able to not end up in this trap that doing more. And that's why, our generation, I want to end with this, because this is why I think it is such a particular moment for each one of us who is alive today, and particularly those of you who will see some of this stuff play out even more starkly in your lives, and perhaps those of us who are a bit older. We live in the age of the Anthropocene, and you probably have heard this term, and you might think, well, another one of those highfalutin concepts. If you ever have a chance, do read up a little bit about it, because there are two powerful thoughts that I think will define what happens next. One is, it says that the human societies, human beings, somewhere in the last 100 years or so, have reached a point where they are actually capable of changing the geophysical future of this planet. And this is the debate that we're moving out of the Holocene into the Anthropocene, where human beings are, in a sense, a defining actor as a species. And that you can interpret in two ways. It's a threat to the future, but what the Anthropocene also says, it happens at an age where humanity has unprecedented knowledge, science, technology, wealth, capacity, people to choose different futures. Never, never in human history, and that I think is incontestable, have we had as much at our disposal to determine what happens next than today on the 20th, is it April? 2017, and it goes by the day. I think we just have to accept that we cannot complain about lack of opportunity to do things differently, at least as a collective. I mean, if you're a person who lives in Yemen right now, or in Somalia in the middle of the drought, your only choice is to figure out where you're going to get your next day's meal. But as a global community of people on the front lines of science, of finance, technology, governance, it's unprecedented, right? And that's why, when I stand up in front of the scientists at this 1.5 degree conference and say, please, stick to your science and tell us how serious it is and how narrow the time window is, but don't prejudge our capacity to choose different futures. That's, I hope, the most important part of what the current debate can give us. Thank you very much.